Hello. We're pleased that you were able to join us today for what we believe is a timely and very critical discussion about the role of economic developers in the recovery. We're talking about three recoveries today. One is recovering from the deadly coronavirus pandemic. The other is recovering from the pandemic-driven recession. And the third is recovering from the long-standing systemic virus of racial inequality, inequity, and injustice. They all have been dropped on us at one time. Think of a mixing bowl, and they're all mixed together. And since they all have an economic connection, they all fall within the purview of the economic developer, because the solutions to all of them will have some bearing on how fast, how rapid, how evenly dispersed economic recovery occurs. Let's begin with the pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic infected over 7 million Americans within the last 10 months. People who were otherwise deemed healthy, maybe obese, or maybe with diabetes, or maybe with something, but otherwise healthy. It killed 200,000 people. And it disrupted the homes and lives and families and health of a whole lot more. Let's take a glimpse at the economics. In order to contain and go into a mitigation phase of trying to control this runaway monster, public policy decision makers decided that we needed to shut down the economy because the virus spread rapidly through a process that epidemiologists call community spread and social contact. So they put in place social distancing and mask wearing and other forms of isolation and quarantines to keep people relatively safe until a cure or vaccine could be found. The decision was to shut down the economy. It was done in phases by different states in different ways on different schedules. Some wise, some not so wise, but they were done the way they were done. And so the virus has not yet been contained. It's been slowed, but still not contained. Thousands of people are still being affected. Thousands of people are still dying as a result. And there's no end in sight. Although a vaccine or several vaccines are in research and development, it's not expected that we'll have a vaccine that's available to the general public until late this year or the spring of next year, and probably not distributed to a majority of the people until probably the end of the year. And both epidemiologists and economists believe that it will be several months, perhaps a couple years after the vaccine is widely available, before the confidence of people who had been staying at home and sheltering in place will believe that they can go out and congregate as they did before without fear of contacting the virus and perhaps increasing the risk of dying. So the economists are saying that we're likely to have a long recovery. Economist Austin Goolsbee, who was the chief economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, indicated at the very beginning, we have to fix the economy. We have to fix the virus before we can fix the economy. That has to be done. And it took us a while to get there, but I think there is some understanding now that only by giving consumers the confidence that they can spend freely in brick and mortar will we begin to regain the robust growth that we had before in the economy. Mark Zandi, another economist with Moody's Analytics, indicated that at 8.4%, which is where we were last month, the employment rate dropped from 14.7% in March, April to 8.4% last month, that we still are only about 72% recovered from where we were in March before all of this started, which means that there's still tens of thousands of people who are unemployed, without income, and therefore not spending. For many of the people who were spending during the recession, they were spending online. So you had businesses like Amazon and eBay, and you had Zoom, and you had Cisco's WebEx, and several other technology-driven companies that did very, very well, e-commerce. And I'll just make a note here. We probably won't have time to get into it very much, but the industry sector that did the best was the technology sector. And here is where the pandemic really gave a boost to the application of advanced technologies, of disruptive technologies, in the artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and the virtual reality. Many of those technologies found their way into both the business to consumer, B2C, as well as into B2B with hospitals and vaccines and sanitizing public spaces and things like that with robots. All of that evolved or accelerated because of the pandemic. And those are growth sectors that we as economic developers need to latch onto as we look at growing our profession to the next level. But anyway, going back to the economy, we have now all of these businesses that are not getting enough sales to cover their costs and their expenses. And many are in deep, deep, deep trouble. Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics indicated that 25% of shopping malls will close within the next 3 to 5 years. That 15% of office space will diminish within the next 3 to 5 years. That 10% of, I'm sorry, not 15% of office space, it was 15% of apartment building space. And about 10% of office space will shrink or disappear within the next 3 to 5 years. There are reports that at least 5 million medium and small sized businesses are at risk of closing today if the market doesn't change, if the environment doesn't change, if conditions don't change. Okay? There are reports that at least 100,000 minority-owned businesses have already closed, and many of them were located in minority communities, in marginal and economically marginal, in some cases depressed communities that serve the population of those communities, not always, but often. We have businesses that are closing that are owned by people who cannot afford to stay in that business anymore. So they are walking away from the business in many instances, turning the key in other instances. They are looking for something else to do, maybe start another business, but if not, it is to get some training and something to help them make a livelihood. That's one group of folk that we have to deal with. Another group of folk are those people who have the financial wherewithal, deep pockets, or relationships that allow them to still have hope. So they can go through a process of consolidating or reorganizing, restructuring, or whatever in order to continue making money using a different business model. We have a responsibility to work with them as well. And then in the middle, there's the remainder. It's what's left. It is the businesses that are closed that have to be liquidated in many cases. It is the businesses that are still going that are in foreclosure that have to be dealt with. There will be bankruptcies and foreclosures and all of those things taking place that the economic developer will have some responsibility for. We are the guardians of the tax base of our cities. And we can't just stand by and observe these things happening without getting involved. So as we look at the new dimension of the role of the economic developer, it is to address the triage of economic development. It's really to become, in many ways, triage specialist of dealing with this group, going out, of this group, staying in, and of all the stuff that they once had, were involved in, of finding out what to do with that, of taking inventory of all of that, of putting together strategic plans for all of that in the context of everything else that's taking place. So what is the role of the economic developer within this triage concept? Is facilitators, conveners, interveners, difference makers, catalytic agents, change agents, troubleshooters, problem solvers. So working with the owners, working with the partners, working with the investors, working with the lenders, working with the lessees and the lessors. All of these folk are in a situation that we call workout. It has to be worked out. And the businesses involved are not businesses that started out with C, D, or E credit, let's say. They were AAA rated businesses at some point, but they had AAA rated credit at some point, many of them. And now they have their poor credit, not from mismanagement, but as a result of the virus and the recession. So we have this vast, it's not a wasteland, it's a troubled land. It's a landscape that has begun to change and will change even more dramatically before all of the vacancies that have occurred in these buildings. In some cases, you have big buildings and they're partially vacant. In other cases, you have small buildings that are totally vacant. You have land that needs to be developed, that plans were in place, but over the next 2 to 3 years, they may or may not happen. And if so, they may be reconfigured, redesigned before it does happen. All of this plays into the new normal for the economic developer. Before, we were dealing essentially with marketing and promotion and planning and analysis of the world the way it was then. Today, we're dealing with troubleshooting and reorganizing and restructuring and trying to save as many businesses as we can. Business retention and expansion today is trying to save as many of those businesses as we can. But the professional economic developer and the professional economic development practitioner can't do it by themselves. Every mayor, every council member, every planning and zone official, board members, what have you, civic leaders, community leaders, faith-based leaders, labor leaders, all have a role to play in this. And in a very, very important way, need to view themselves as economic developers. So there's a question of whether or not cities can really survive given all of this. And many say no, they can't. I say yes, 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 they can. I say that if the city of Chicago in 1871 could survive the Great Fire that destroyed their central business district, that burned down buildings and took out 20,000 or so businesses, if they could survive from that, then we can survive. It takes leadership, political will, vision, desire to get involved, roll up the sleeves and get directly involved and understand what we, the professional economic developers and practitioners, are faced with. Not just from board meetings or council meetings or committee meetings or hearings, but by being out there with us as we go through some of these processes. I say that if the city of New York City, could survive the blizzard of 1888, then we can survive what we're going through now. In Chicago, the innovation was, with everybody thinking as economic development problem solvers, that the buildings burned down because they were built of wood framing. And if we want to put together buildings and businesses that are more resistant to recessions and to extreme conditions, then we have to account for that and how the buildings are built. And so they issued ordinances and mandates that future buildings would be built of steel. Not just low rise, but mid rise and high rise also. And lo and behold, what came of that? With skyscrapers. Chicago, okay, put skyscrapers on the map big time as a result of the trauma and drama that they went through because of the fire. But it was political will, it was intervention, it was desire, it was necessity, it was creativeness, it was innovation, it was innovativeness. And that's what it's going to take for us. Forget about the way we did it in December of last year and January of this year. We have to do it differently. We have to think differently about it. When we looked at from Washington, they do the macroeconomic stuff. That's what the Federal Reserve does, and that's what the federal government does by and large with fiscal stuff. We deal with the microeconomic stuff, the small stuff at ground level. Economic growth is local. Economic development is local. Economic recessions are local. Economic recoveries are local. They happen on the ground in somebody's city, town, state, nation, country. It's on the ground. It's aggregated to be national or international, but it's local. That's us. And that's our role in that process. It's important that we understand within this context that economic growth, even when it's growing at a very high level, is not even. So the economy is pumped up and we got robust growth. And I think in the minds of some people, that's evenly spread throughout the country. So everybody gets an equal share of that. Not so. It is very cyclical and it's very uneven throughout the country. The bulk of the growth goes to those areas that are most attractive, most appealing, easiest to do, and that will provide the highest return on investment to the investors. Those are not usually those opportunities in the heart of the city's tax base. We get some of it, but we have to work harder to get that. We are more on the tail end of that growth wave that's coming through than on the front end of that wave. So if in a robust economy, when unemployment rate was 4%, the economy is producing 80, 85% of all of the growth, evenly spread all over. So your city of mine is getting 85% help from the general economy, the growth in the general economy. There's a 15 to 20% window that is not helping, that it can either be lost or somebody else can take it, or we can get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6% of that to add to the growth of a deficit that our city may be running, or to add to the growth if we're not running a deficit. But we have to capture that. We have to work to get that. It's not going to just fall out. We have to work to get that. That's when we had 4% unemployment. At 8.4%, growth is not at 80 to 85%. It's something less than that, for sake of discussion. Say it's at 25 or 50%, which means that our portion of the tail end of that is not very much. So we have to work doubly hard. There's an urgency about how deep the fiscal and economic hole in the tax base, in the urban tax base is, that we have to work to recover. And yes, we can recover from it, but we have to change our way of thinking altogether. So we need some help from the feds. And so what Chairman Powell is doing with the Federal Reserve is more than what the Federal Reserve would normally do. It's nothing really special for the lower part of the K, but there are some impacts that are felt and experienced by that. The help really has to come from the federal government, which is on the upper part of the K, and the fiscal policies that they put together. And we have a role to help them put together the kind of resources that we need for our cities to dig our way out of those holes. And so a role of the economic developer in whatever city or town that is tax-based oriented, that is fiscal and economic development growth oriented, has to put together their own, initiate their own overall economic development plan, 21st century style, reflecting these conditions to use as guidance. And we have to put with that a comprehensive economic development strategy, 2020 style, that shows how we are going to do that and what needs can be met by the federal and state governments and the private sector. We need to do that. And then we need to impress upon our congressional representatives, the governors and congressional representatives, and people we know in the White House and people we know in the Congress, to put together a serious 21st century style Marshall Plan, a plan that embodies the purposes and the commitment that President Truman made in 1946 to give billions of dollars to Western Europe to help them rebuild their economies after the World War II destruction of their economies. And within that Marshall Plan framework, we drop our overall economic development plans, aggregates, and our comprehensive economic development strategies. And within that, we find elements of legislation, of acts that have been approved by Congress already that had some value in their application to address many of these problems. What immediately comes to mind is those things that I'm most familiar with from personal experience, beginning with President Johnson's War on Poverty. Within his War on Poverty program, there was an Economic Opportunity Act that allowed for community-based organizations, CDCs, to be established and funded directly through line items in the federal budget. And the flexible use of federal resources for equity and debt to acquire land, to build buildings, to own buildings, to train people in the ownership and working within those buildings. I had the opportunity to work with the United Durham Incorporated, UDI, which was a supermarket in Durham, not far from the campus that I did my undergraduate work at North Carolina Central University. Another experience that was much larger scale was in Hancock County, Georgia, where the CDC there bought a 500-acre plantation, and it was converted into a commercial catfish farm. And they were selling catfish to the regional supermarkets and grocery stores in that area. And small farmers started developing their own little small catfish farms. So the whole economy of scale of things started to ripple, okay? The rock thrown into the pond started creating waves. All of that was working well. That's what worked then, and that's what's needed now. 21st century style. So there's some new bells and whistles that can be added to that. But in addition to that, we need some of the most beneficial and valuable aspects of the empowerment zone legislation, of the enterprise zone legislation, of the opportunity zone legislation, of the promise zone legislation, and new emerging thoughts should be added to that as well. And with that kind of a resource, it can enable us, if we have already organized ourselves and if we are operating within the context of that overall economic development plan and that comprehensive economic development strategy process, then we can begin to work our way out of that hole. But the way they have to develop that legislation and that process is let growth continue to grow at the top, but we've got to redirect more growth down to the lower level. You can do things at the top automatically. That's just market-driven stuff. It's going to happen. In the middle, mostly market-driven, but more public-private stuff. Down here is a different beast altogether, by and large. It's mostly self-help. And another experience for me was in the faith-based sector. My church in Detroit, Michigan, Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, acquired property on the streets adjacent to the church and bought 100 acres of land from a hospital that had closed. And we were able to demolish the hospital, and we got a 50-year lease from Kmart to build one of the largest Kmarts that they had in their system at the time, hired lots of people who would not otherwise have been employed, facilitated a lot of indoor businesses that were in the Kmart. And on the street adjacent to the church, we actually had storefronts that had become used by franchises, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried, and other franchises at that time that really brought life and vitality back. And Detroit is a hotbed for faith-based oriented activities, as are some other cities. But it's understanding the economics of development. And so far, public policy has encouraged development in the upper half of that K, if you will. It's not put much emphasis on what is in the lower end of that K. We throw lipstick on it. Okay, we give lip service to it. We call it community development. We call it housing. We call it social services and all of that. But we don't try to grow the economic base of the city by increasing the value of the real estate and increasing the value of the people's lives and their sense of self-worth and net worth, okay, within that context. So that's where we have to go. Now, I know the time is running out. I probably have run a bit over, but I've tried to compress within 30, 35 minutes what would otherwise be 60 hours or one or two semesters if we were in a university classroom having these discussions. But we'll stop here. And if anybody has interest in understanding any of what we have summarized here much better, you can buy a couple books that I've published. One is The Fiscal Imperatives of Next Generation Fiscal and Economic Development Growth that we published last October. And the newest one is one that was a takeoff from that one, but it blended very nicely into the situation that we are experiencing right now. And it's called The Role of Economic Developers in Economic Recoveries, Pandemics, and recessions, and other socioeconomic disruptions. Really not disruptions, but disparities. And how to deal with those things from an economic point of view and from an economic development point of view. And that is an urban economic development point of view. So with that, you can, if you're interested in the book, you can go to my website at www.kensleyenterprises.com and get all the information on the company and on the purchase of the book online. And if you want to communicate with me via email, you can do that at info@kensleyenterprises.com. Or if you want to call, you can call me at area code 404-563-6225. And with that, we will end this part of the session, and we will transition now to the question and answer portion of it. I thank you for your time and attention, and I certainly hope that you'll give serious thought to our discussion. And I invite you to let's drill deeper into the meaning and the urgency associated with action involved in this discussion. Thank you.